Here's a number that should stop you cold. 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the temperature the Orion capsule will generate when it hits Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. The surface of the Sun runs at about 10,000 degrees, meaning the Artemis II crew is about to experience half a sun wrapped around their capsule. After the uncrewed Artemis I test flight, engineers found that the heat shield had charred and eroded in ways the models didn't predict. They updated the models. They cleared the mission. And now 4 astronauts are coming home on that same heat shield, after 3 days soaking in a radiation environment that has been quietly stressing their onboard electronics, and an active sunspot region with a 10% chance of firing an X-class flare still pointed at them. NASA says the risk is acceptable. The models said that before too. Tonight I'm going to show you exactly what they mean by acceptable, and let you decide whether you agree. Stay until the end. Hit subscribe and stay close, because this story is not finished. The return window is opening. The most dangerous phase is still ahead. And everything we've just uncovered is about to be tested in real time. This channel has followed this mission from the beginning. We're not stopping now. We will be here for whatever comes next. You will want to be here too. Now, let us get into it. 4 human beings are currently farther from Earth than any people have been in over 50 years. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, a Canadian astronaut among them, making this the first time Canada has sent a crew member to lunar distance, completed their flyby of the moon. And if you've been following the news, you've seen the coverage, the celebrations, the press conferences, the historic imagery. 400,000 kilometers from Earth. First crewed lunar pass since Apollo 17 in 1972. It is genuinely extraordinary, and if that's where your attention stopped, I completely understand why. But here's the thing. The flyby was never the dangerous part. Artemis II is not, at its core, a lunar science mission. It is not primarily about what the crew sees when they pass the moon, or what photographs they take, or what data they gather at lunar distance. Those things matter, but structurally, at the mission architecture level, Artemis II exists to answer one question. Can we certify a crewed Orion capsule for the full loop? Launch, transit, flyby, and most critically, return. Everything up to this moment was the setup. What comes next is the actual test. Mission Control already knows this. If you could listen to the comms right now, you'd notice a shift in cadence. The celebration tone, the "you are making history" tone, has given way to something quieter and more procedural. Checklists are being run. Systems are being validated. The crew, by all accounts trained and prepared for this moment, is in what you might call quiet return mode. They are not sightseeing anymore. They are configuring. The trajectory itself is doing something interesting right now. After the flyby, gravity is already doing some of the work. The spacecraft is riding what's called a free return trajectory, a curved path that the moon's own gravitational field bends back toward Earth. Apollo missions use the same principle. You pass close enough to the moon, and the geometry of the solar system essentially pulls you home. It sounds elegant, and it is. But elegant physics does not mean easy engineering. Here is the comparison that keeps coming up in aerospace circles, and it's worth sitting with. Apollo missions were short. Apollo 11 was 8 days total. Apollo 17, the last crewed moon mission, lasted about 12 days. Those crews faced extreme environments, solved real-time problems, and came home on technology that was, by today's standards, remarkably simple. Analog systems, limited autonomy, blunt capsule ballistic re-entry, where physics more or less did what the models predicted. Artemis II operates in a fundamentally different regime: extended transit exposure, modern digital flight control systems, and a return maneuver that Apollo never attempted at crewed scale. The comparison gives you false confidence. The physics is not the same. The systems are not the same. The risks are not the same. And the fact that the public narrative has locked onto historic flyby while glossing over what comes next is, honestly, the most NASA thing that could possibly happen. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's a cover-up. I'm saying the most important part of this mission is the part that generates the least photogenic content. No moon in the frame. No smiling astronauts waving at cameras. Just a small capsule, 4 people inside it, and a planet getting slowly larger in the window. And somewhere in that approach, a sequence of events that has never been tested with a crew on board. Everything up to this point was, in the broadest sense, the easy part. What comes next is where Artemis II either proves itself or teaches us something we didn't expect. And given what we already know about the heat shield, something we didn't expect is not a phrase you want appearing in the mission debrief. The number itself is almost impossible to process. 25,000 miles per hour. Roughly 40,000 kilometers per hour. That is the speed at which the Orion capsule will meet Earth's atmosphere. And if you've ever wondered why re-entry is considered one of the most dangerous phases of any crewed spaceflight, the answer starts right there, with that number. When an object moves that fast through even the thin upper layers of atmosphere, the air in front of it cannot get out of the way fast enough. It compresses, and compressed air heats up, not a little. The plasma sheath that forms around a re-entering capsule at peak heating reaches approximately 2,760 degrees Celsius. That is roughly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. For reference, the surface of the Sun runs at about 5,500 degrees Celsius. You are, during this window, generating temperatures that are in the same order of magnitude as stellar surface conditions, around a spacecraft with 4 living people inside it. Now, here's where Artemis II separates itself from everything that came before it at a crude scale. Apollo capsules used what's called ballistic re-entry. You aim the capsule, you hit the atmosphere, and physics decelerates you in essentially a straight-line plunge. It's brutal. Apollo crews experienced up to 8 times the force of gravity during re-entry, but it's relatively predictable. You go in, you slow down, you land. The trajectory is mostly locked once you've committed. Orion does something different. It performs what aerospace engineers call skip re-entry. And if you've never heard that term, it's exactly what it sounds like. The capsule dips into the upper atmosphere at a shallow angle, generates aerodynamic lift. Yes, lift. The same force that keeps airplanes in the air, uses that lift to bounce back out of the atmosphere briefly, and then comes back in for the final descent. 2 atmospheric interactions instead of 1. 2 heating events instead of 1. 2 peaks of thermal stress on every material, every seal, and every sensor on that vehicle. NASA uses skip entry for a very good reason. It reduces the peak G load on the crew, spreading the deceleration over a longer time. Instead of hitting 8 Gs in a single brutal plunge, the forces are more manageable. It also allows more precise landing zone targeting, which matters enormously for Pacific Ocean recovery operations. These are real engineering benefits. The trade-off is complexity. You now have a vehicle that must actively manage its own trajectory during a phase where the aerodynamic environment is changing faster than any human could manually respond to. The guidance computers are making dozens of corrections per second during skip entry. The spacecraft is, for all practical purposes, flying itself through one of the most physically extreme environments it will ever encounter. And there is one more thing about skip re-entry that doesn't get talked about enough. During peak heating, the plasma sheath that forms around the capsule is electrically conductive. It blocks radio signals. Mission control goes silent. The crew goes silent. Everyone on Earth watching a mission status screen watches the telemetry drop to 0 and waits. This phase is called the plasma blackout, and it typically lasts several minutes. During those minutes, if something goes wrong, there is nothing anyone on the ground can do. No commands can be sent. No data comes back. The spacecraft is completely autonomous, navigating the most dangerous moment of the mission, while 4 human beings sit inside and trust the engineering. You are most vulnerable. In other words, at the exact moment, you are completely unreachable. That detail alone should reframe how you think about what getting home actually means for this crew, and it would be concerning enough on its own. But there's a layer underneath all of this that most coverage has completely skipped over, something that happened on the last time this exact vehicle flew. Before Artemis II, there was Artemis I, and Artemis I was uncrewed, a full test flight of the Orion capsule and space launch system without any astronauts aboard, which launched in November of 2022 and successfully completed its mission. From a public perspective, it was a triumph. Beautiful imagery, successful splashdown, a system-level validation of the architecture. NASA celebrated it, rightly so. But when engineers got the capsule back and looked at the heat shield up close, they found something that did not match their predictions. The Orion heat shield uses a material called AV coat, an ablative thermal protection system, which means it works by controlled burning. Instead of reflecting heat, it absorbs it, and the outer material chars and erodes away in a carefully designed process that carries heat energy off the vehicle's surface. The design has heritage going back to Apollo. It is not a new idea. But the way it behaved on Artemis I was, in certain areas, not what the model said it should do. Engineers found uneven charring patterns across the shield surface. More critically, they found zones of deeper than predicted material loss, areas where the AV coat had eroded further than the thermal models forecast it would. They also found asymmetry in how different sections of the shield responded, which the pre-flight simulations had not fully captured. The behavior was not uniform. The predictions were not matched. And the root cause, the exact physical mechanism driving the divergence between model and reality, was not fully resolved before the decision to proceed with Artemis II was made. Now, I want to be precise here, because precision matters when we're talking about a crewed mission. NASA did not find a structural failure. The heat shield did not crack. The capsule did not come close to breaching. The material loss, while deeper than predicted in certain zones, was still within what NASA classified as acceptable margins. The crew would not have been in immediate danger based on those Artemis I results. I want to be clear about that. NASA assessed the data, ran follow-on analysis, and reached the conclusion that the anomaly was within acceptable risk parameters for a crewed flight. But here is what that assessment does not resolve. Acceptable risk is not the same as understood behavior. The models did not predict what happened. The models were adjusted after the fact to accommodate the observations. But a model that explains data it has already seen is a very different thing from a model that accurately predicts data it hasn't seen yet. The divergence between prediction and outcome on Artemis I is a flag, not a red light, not a stop sign, but a yellow flag that says, we do not fully understand every variable driving this system's behavior under real flight conditions. And Artemis II is not Artemis I. Artemis II is longer. The crew has been in transit for an extended period. The thermal protection system will face every physical condition it faced on the test flight, plus the additions of a crewed capsule's heat signature, plus whatever cumulative effects the transit environment has introduced to the vehicle's materials. The shield that surprised everyone on the uncrewed test will now face a crewed re-entry. The engineers know this. They've run the analysis. They've accepted the risk. But there is a statement that has started circulating quietly in aerospace engineering discussions, and it's one I think summarizes the situation better than any official press release. The shield worked, but not entirely for reasons we fully understand. And if that doesn't make you want to understand what the crew has been flying through for the past 72 hours, I'm not sure what will. There is a body 150 million kilometers from Earth, that has a say in every crewed spaceflight mission, and it does not ask for permission before it acts. The Sun right now is not in a quiet phase. Solar Cycle 25, the current activity cycle, has been running hotter than forecasters predicted. And over the past 72 hours, the Artemis II crew has been transiting through an elevated space weather environment that deserves far more attention than it's been getting in mainstream mission coverage. Let's establish what we're actually measuring here. Space weather, in practical terms, refers to the particle and electromagnetic radiation environment generated by solar activity. Solar flares, coronal mass ejections, high-energy proton events, electron flux surges. These are the variables that space weather forecasters at NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center monitor around the clock. For crewed missions beyond low Earth orbit, where the protective bubble of Earth's magnetic field no longer applies, these variables are not background noise. They are active mission parameters. What the crew has been exposed to during their transit is a sustained, elevated electron flux environment. Readings in the range of 6,000 particle flux units at the high energy electron range. That is significantly elevated above baseline. Alongside that, there has been geomagnetic storm activity during the early transit phase, which indicates that the interplanetary environment the spacecraft is moving through has been energetically active. And currently, as the crew approaches Earth for re-entry, there is an active sunspot region carrying approximately a 10% probability of producing an X-class solar flare, the most energetically powerful category of solar flare, while it remains pointed in the direction of the inner solar system. A 10% probability might not sound alarming, but consider what a 10% chance means when you are evaluating a system with 4 human lives in it, in an unrecoverable situation, with no abort options. In engineering risk management, that is not a number you dismiss. It is a number you design around, or at minimum, a number you monitor with great attention. The electron flux situation is the quieter of the two concerns, but in some ways, the more technically interesting one. High-energy electrons are not the dramatic, instantly visible threat of a proton event or a coronal mass ejection. They don't cause immediate radiation sickness. They don't trigger the kind of acute health response that generates headlines. What they do is infiltrate materials. They penetrate the outer layers of a spacecraft, and they accumulate inside insulating components, inside the plastic and composite materials that make up circuit boards, sensor housings, wire insulation, and structural panels. The buildup is slow and cumulative. A single brief electron flux event is not a serious concern, but sustained exposure over a 72-hour transit at elevated levels is something that onboard dosimetry systems are tracking carefully, because the effects are not always immediate, and they are not always visible until the moment they become consequential. And if you think that sounds like a slow developing problem that engineering teams might be tempted to underestimate, well, that brings us to something that happens inside the capsule walls that almost nobody in the public conversation is talking about. There is a phenomenon in spacecraft engineering called dielectric charging, and it is one of those technical concepts that sounds almost too abstract to matter until you understand the chain of consequences it can set off. The word dielectric refers to an electrically insulating material, something that does not conduct electricity freely, like plastic, rubber, or certain composite materials. When high-energy electrons flood the environment around a spacecraft, some of those electrons penetrate past the conductive outer layers of the vehicle and bury themselves in the insulating layers beneath. And because insulators don't conduct, those electrons stay where they land. They accumulate. They build up a static charge inside the material itself, not on the surface where it could dissipate, but locked inside the structure of the insulator. The discharge, when it comes, is not predictable in its timing or its location. It can look like a sudden spike of electrical noise on a sensor that was previously reading cleanly. It can look like a timing anomaly in a digital system, a clock that momentarily jumps, a data packet that arrives corrupted, a guidance input that registers slightly differently than it should. It can look like nothing visible at all, while quietly skewing the input data that a flight computer is using to make navigation decisions. None of these effects, in isolation, constitute a spacecraft emergency. NASA engineers design for noise and anomalies. Redundant systems exist precisely to catch single-point discrepancies. But here is where the context of Artemis II makes this more than an academic concern. The skip re-entry maneuver is a guidance-critical event. The angle at which the Orion capsule enters the atmosphere is not a rough estimate. It is calculated to within fractions of a degree. Entry too steep means more deceleration force and higher peak heating. Entry too shallow, and the capsule skips off the atmosphere entirely, missing its landing zone, or, in an extreme scenario, failing to decelerate adequately. The guidance system maintains that angle by making continuous small corrections based on sensor inputs. Those sensors have been in a sustained electron flux environment for 72 hours. The chain of concern looks like this, and I want to be clear that I'm describing a risk pathway, not a predicted outcome. Sustained electron flux leads to dielectric charge, buildup in insulating materials. Charge buildup increases the probability of sporadic discharge events. Discharge events can introduce noise into sensor systems. Sensor noise, even at small magnitudes, can affect the precision of guidance corrections. Guidance corrections during skip entry directly determine the trajectory and heat load distribution across the vehicle. Heat load distribution interacts with the behavior of an AV coat heat shield that already showed anomalous response on its test flight. None of these links in the chain individually represents a crisis, but they are coupled. And the end of that chain sits directly on top of the unresolved question from Artemis I. Apollo missions were not immune to space weather, but those vehicles operated on analog systems with far fewer coupled digital dependencies. A bit of electrical noise in an Apollo-era system was more likely to be absorbed by the physical tolerances of the hardware. Artemis operates on modern, high-precision digital avionics. The sensitivity that makes those systems more capable also makes them respond to smaller inputs. The same engineering that gives Artemis II its precision is the same engineering that is potentially more susceptible to the precise kind of interference that a 72-hour electron flux soak produces. And the combination of that exposure profile with a first crewed skip re-entry sits in a regime that honestly has not been extensively flight-proven. Which brings us to the question of what happens when you stack uncertainties that are each individually acceptable, and ask whether the stack itself has ever been tested. People keep reaching for Apollo when they try to reassure themselves about Artemis II. It's understandable. Apollo is the benchmark, the proof of concept, the historical record that says humans can survive the journey to the moon and back. If we did it 11 times starting in 1969, surely modern engineering with 50 additional years of development can manage it again. The logic feels solid. The logic is, in some important ways, misleading. Apollo missions were extraordinary acts of human and engineering endurance, but their risk profile was meaningfully different from what Artemis II is navigating. The longest Apollo mission, Apollo 17, lasted 12 days total. Apollo 11 was 8 days. These were short excursions by comparison to what extended cislunar operations will eventually look like, and even by comparison to what Artemis II's transit and return timeline involves. Short missions mean less cumulative radiation exposure, less time for slow developing material effects to accumulate, less total operational time for low probability anomalies to find their window. Apollo re-entry was ballistic. The capsule came in steep, slowed fast, and landed hard. The thermal protection system had one job: survive one heating event in one predictable configuration, at a well-characterized entry angle. The models for that system were validated across multiple test flights before the first crewed mission, and the geometry of the problem was simpler. When you perform a single ballistic re-entry, you are testing one set of thermal conditions. When you perform a skip re-entry, you are testing two sets, in sequence, with an intermediate phase of atmospheric dynamics that ballistic re-entry never encounters. And the avionics gap is probably the most underappreciated difference. Apollo's flight computers were, by modern standards, primitive. The guidance computer on Apollo 11 had roughly 4 kilobytes of RAM and ran at approximately 1 megahertz. It was a marvel of its era, and its simplicity was, paradoxically, a form of robustness. Digital systems with limited complexity have limited failure modes. A system that only does a few things can only fail in a few ways. Modern spacecraft avionics are orders of magnitude more capable. They can also fail in orders of magnitude more ways. The interdependencies between software systems, sensor networks, guidance algorithms, and communication interfaces create a web of coupling points that simply did not exist in the Apollo architecture. This is not an argument that Artemis is worse than Apollo. It is vastly more capable. The crew has better life support, better navigation, better abort options, better real-time monitoring. The engineering margin is enormous compared to what those Apollo crews flew with. But capability and complexity are not opposites. They are correlated. More capable systems are more complex. More complex systems have more interdependencies. More interdependencies mean more places where a small, unexpected input can travel through the system in ways that the engineers didn't model. Because modeling all possible pathways in a sufficiently complex system is not a fully solvable problem. We are no longer just surviving space. We are synchronizing systems inside it. And what happens when those synchronized systems all arrive at the same moment, carrying their individual uncertainties, and the atmosphere starts to push back? That's the question that Act 3 is really about. Every risk we have talked about so far has been assessed. The heat shield anomaly from Artemis I was reviewed, analyzed, and cleared for crewed flight. The elevated electron flux environment was tracked by onboard dosimetry and flagged in real time by space weather monitoring teams. The complexity of skip entry guidance was validated in simulation and on the Artemis I uncrewed flight. Each of these items went through a certification process. Each was evaluated against a threshold of acceptable risk. Each, individually, received a green light. And that is all accurate and important to acknowledge. NASA does not cut corners on these assessments. The engineers who reviewed these items are among the best aerospace professionals in the world. But here is the distinction that engineering philosophy calls the difference between validation and full system understanding. Certification means that a given parameter, under a given set of test conditions, fell within a defined acceptable range. It means the analysis was completed, and the conclusion was reached that the risk was bounded and manageable. It does not mean that the behavior of that parameter, combined with other parameters that are also individually certified, in a configuration that was never simultaneously present during testing, has been fully characterized. That last part is the gap that experienced aerospace engineers lose sleep over, and the public rarely hears about, because it doesn't fit neatly into a press release. Consider the specific combination present on Artemis II. You have a heat shield with a known model divergence, real-world behavior that outpaced predictions on the test flight. You have avionics that have been soaking in an elevated electron flux environment for 72 hours, with the potential for accumulated dielectric charging effects. You have a guidance system that will autonomously navigate a two-phase atmospheric entry, making real-time corrections based on sensors that have been in that same electron environment. And you have a plasma blackout phase, during which no external intervention is possible, and all of this is happening simultaneously. each of those elements cleared its own certification review. But the end-to-end system, this particular combination, under these particular transit conditions, on a crewed vehicle, has not been tested in this configuration before. Because it couldn't be. Artemis II is the test. That is what a first crewed qualification flight means, even when you try very hard not to say it out loud. The aerospace industry has a concept for this situation. It's sometimes called the unknown unknown problem, or in engineering risk management, the problem of unmodeled coupling. You can identify every known failure mode. You can test every individual subsystem. But the interactions between subsystems, especially in extreme dynamic environments, can generate behaviors that none of the individual subsystem models predicted, because the subsystem models were built in isolation. Real flight doesn't happen in isolation. Real flight is one enormous simultaneous coupled system test, and the atmosphere does not grade on a curve. Skip re-entry looks, from the outside, like a single elegant maneuver. The capsule dips, bounces, and descends. The way it's often described in public communications makes it sound almost graceful, a controlled skip across the top of the atmosphere. What it actually is, from a systems engineering perspective, is a multi-phase coupled event, in which the output of every decision in the first phase directly shapes the input conditions for the second phase. The guidance system sets the entry angle. The entry angle determines the depth of atmospheric penetration. The depth of penetration determines the dynamic pressure, the physical force of the atmosphere pushing on the capsule's surface. Dynamic pressure determines heat load. Heat load determines how the AV coat material responds, how fast it ablates, how evenly it erodes, how well it manages the thermal energy coming into the capsule wall. And the way the AV coat responds affects the capsule's aerodynamic profile, because the surface geometry changes slightly as material is lost, which feeds back into the aerodynamic forces, which feeds back into what the guidance system sees as its reference conditions for the second atmospheric entry. The system is not a sequence of independent steps. It is a feedback loop. This matters enormously for Artemis II because the first phase of the skip is where the first heating event occurs, and that is where the AV coat behavior that diverged from models on Artemis I is most critical to understand. If the material response in the first heating event follows the anomalous pattern observed on Artemis I, the surface geometry during the intermediate skip phase is slightly different than the model assumes. The guidance system, working from its navigation sensors and aerodynamic models, is making corrections against a reference that may not perfectly match the physical reality of the vehicle it's controlling. The second entry then begins from an initial condition that has a small, potentially uncharacterized offset from the nominal trajectory. Think about what it feels like to steer a car on a road that changes its curve radius after every turn you make. You think you know the geometry. You turn the wheel by the amount your experience tells you is correct, but the road has shifted slightly, and your correction is based on the old geometry, not the new one. A skilled driver notices and compensates. A guidance computer running a pre-programmed algorithm compensates based on sensor input. And if that sensor input carries noise from 72 hours of electron flux exposure, the correction may itself introduce a small error that propagates through the second entry phase. Small errors in atmospheric entry do not stay small. The atmosphere is a non-linear environment. Small deviations in entry conditions can produce disproportionately large changes in trajectory and heat load distribution. This is not hypothetical physics. This is the documented behavior of hypersonic atmospheric entry vehicles. And it is precisely why the skip entry guidance algorithms are among the most carefully designed systems on the Orion capsule. The question is whether they were designed for the specific combination of conditions that Artemis II is now carrying into the entry corridor. There is a particular kind of engineering humility that the best aerospace engineers carry. It goes something like this: the model is always right, until reality disagrees. Models are built from assumptions. Those assumptions are drawn from prior flight experience, ground testing, and physical theory. In well-characterized regimes, situations that closely resemble conditions that have been tested many times before, the models are excellent. They are reliable. The predictions hold. But every time a vehicle enters a regime that hasn't been extensively tested, the model is operating on extrapolation rather than interpolation. It is reaching beyond its validated range. And in those moments, the divergence between prediction and reality can show up in ways nobody expected. Because by definition, if you expected it, you would have put it in the model. This is exactly what happened with the Artemis I heat shield. The AV coat system was modeled based on ground testing, wind tunnel data, prior re-entry vehicles, and the thermal physics of ablative materials. The models were good. They were the product of decades of refinement. And then the capsule came back, and the shield had developed charring and erosion patterns that the models didn't produce. The engineers did not make a mistake in their process. The process was rigorous. The reality was operating in a slightly different parameter space than the model covered, and that space produced behavior the model hadn't seen. The response to that situation in aerospace is to update the model. You incorporate the new observations. You adjust the parameters. You run new analyses with the revised model and check whether the original flight was still within safe margins under the corrected understanding. That process happened before Artemis II was approved for flight. The analysis was run, the margins were checked, and the conclusion was that the risk was acceptable. But the model update was not a root cause resolution. It was a recalibration, a way of accounting for the observed divergence without necessarily explaining the underlying physical mechanism that produced it. The model now fits the Artemis I data. What it cannot guarantee is that it fully covers the Artemis II conditions, because Artemis II is not Artemis I. The entry conditions are different. The transit history is different. The solar environment has been different. And the vehicle carrying a crew behaves slightly differently, thermodynamically, mass distribution-wise, than an uncrewed configuration. This is normal in spaceflight development cycles. This is how every new vehicle class gets certified. You don't have perfect models before the first crewed flight. You have the best models available, validated against the best data available, with margins designed to absorb the uncertainty you know exists, an additional margin designed to absorb some of the uncertainty you don't know exists. The goal is never to eliminate unknowns. The goal is to reduce them until the remaining uncertainty is bounded within a range that careful, experienced engineers are willing to accept responsibility for. And every one of those engineers knows, at some level that doesn't make it into the public debrief, that the real validation is the flight itself. Artemis II is not just a mission. It is, in the most fundamental sense, a reality test. And reality, unlike a model, doesn't care what the pre-flight analysis said. While 4 astronauts are navigating their way home through a space weather environment that has been running elevated for 3 days, the planet they're returning to has not been sitting still. Earth's own geological systems have been active in ways that, while completely unrelated to the mission overhead, create an interesting psychological frame for thinking about what it means to live on a dynamic, restless planet, and what it means to be leaving one for the first time in more than 50 years. The Kermadec region, north of New Zealand, has been registering a seismic swarm of magnitude 5 and above events over recent days. Clusters of earthquakes generated by the plate boundary stress in one of the most seismically active zones on the planet. The Molucca Sea, in the complex tectonic environment of the Indonesian archipelago, has been running its own multi-day earthquake sequence. These are not unusual events for those regions. Seismically active zones generate seismic activity, but the aggregate picture of a planet generating heat and pressure from within, shaking and adjusting along its crustal boundaries, while 4 of its inhabitants are absent, is a reminder that Earth itself is not a stable, static backdrop. It is a system. It is active. It has its own dynamics that proceed entirely without reference to human schedules or human significance. There are also ongoing flood alerts and regional atmospheric instability across multiple continents, driven by a global climate system that has been in an elevated energy state for years now. None of this is connected to the mission. There is no mechanism by which the Artemis II return trajectory is influenced by an earthquake near the Kermadec Trench. But the simultaneity creates a particular emotional texture. The world that the crew left is not the world of a quiet afternoon. It is a world in motion, tectonically, meteorologically, geomagnetically. And somewhere between 400,000 kilometers away and the surface of that world, 4 people are trusting an enormous amount of engineering to bring them back to it intact. Something happens to human psychology at lunar distance that has been documented anecdotally across every mission that has gone that far, and studied with more rigor in the context of isolation research for long-duration space missions. When Earth is no longer a surface beneath your feet, or a visible horizon, or a place you are embedded in, when it becomes an object in space, a small blue circle in a window, the cognitive relationship to it changes. It shrinks, in both the literal and psychological sense. The details disappear. You can no longer distinguish continents from oceans with certainty. The seismic swarms and flood warnings and political news that occupy everyone's attention on the surface become invisible and inaudible. The planet becomes, for the first time in your experience, a thing you can look at, rather than a thing you are inside of. Astronauts who have experienced this report a kind of perceptual recalibration that takes time to process fully after returning. The emotional granularity of Earth, the sense that your specific neighborhood, your specific city, your specific country is a uniquely important part of the world, gets replaced, temporarily, by a much flatter, more complete sense of the whole. Some find it clarifying. Some find it disorienting. All of them find it unforgettable. Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon during Apollo 14, described a sudden overwhelming awareness of interconnectedness that he spent the rest of his life trying to articulate. The overview effect, as it came to be called, is not a metaphor. It appears to be a genuine cognitive state shift associated with the specific visual experience of seeing Earth as a finite object against the dark. For the Artemis II crew, the return journey is the reversal of this effect. Earth grows. Details return. The object in the window becomes a surface again. The sense of being embedded in something larger than yourself, rather than outside and above it, reasserts itself. The shift back is probably not as dramatically discussed as the shift out, but it may be its own kind of adjustment. You have been somewhere that no living human being has been in more than 50 years. You have seen the planet from a perspective that fewer than 30 people in all of human history have experienced. And now, you are coming home. And coming home requires that the vehicle carry you through 5,000 degrees of plasma without incident, guided by computers that have been soaking in charged particle radiation for 3 days, protected by a heat shield whose behavior the models got partially wrong the last time. The psychological return and the physical return are not the same journey. Both matter. One of the more visually spectacular consequences of the elevated space weather environment during the Artemis II transit has been auroral activity at mid and low latitudes. People in regions that don't typically see auroras, well, south of the usual auroral zones, have been photographing green and red curtains of light that appear to have no business being at that latitude, and those images have been circulating widely on social media, generating the usual combination of wonder and alarm. And I want to spend a moment on this, because the way that space weather visuals propagate through public channels illustrates something important about the relationship between spectacle and operational consequence. Auroras are generated when charged particles from solar activity interact with Earth's magnetic field and funnel down into the upper atmosphere near the poles. During elevated geomagnetic storms, the auroral oval, the ring-shaped zone around the magnetic poles where auroras typically occur, expands toward lower latitudes. The further south the aurora appears, the stronger the geomagnetic storm that's driving it. Strong enough geomagnetic storms can genuinely affect infrastructure, power grids, satellite communications, navigation systems. The Carrington event of 1859, the strongest recorded geomagnetic storm in history, caused telegraph systems to spark and fire spontaneously across North America and Europe. We have modeled what an equivalent event would do to modern infrastructure, and the numbers are not reassuring. But a visible aurora at mid-latitudes, in the context of the current space weather environment, does not automatically mean that anything catastrophic is in progress operationally. The geomagnetic disturbance levels associated with recent activity have been elevated, but they have not approached the scale of events that would constitute a genuine infrastructure threat or a mission-critical radiation emergency. The electron flux numbers being reported for the Artemis II transit environment are significant for the specific engineering concerns we've discussed, the dielectric charging concern, the cumulative exposure concern, but they are not in the regime of an acute solar particle event that would require emergency crew sheltering protocols. The distinction matters because public perception of space weather often operates on a simple binary. Either nothing is happening, or something catastrophic is about to happen. The reality is a continuous spectrum of effects across a continuous spectrum of severities, and the operationally interesting zone, where effects are real and technically consequential but not visually dramatic or publicly terrifying, is precisely the zone that tends to get lost between the two extremes. The aurora is real. The elevated electron flux is real. The 10% X-class flare probability is real. And all of those things feed into a technical risk picture that is more nuanced and in some ways more interesting than either "don't worry, it's fine" or "the astronauts are in danger." The nuance is where the actual story lives, and the actual story is about to reach its most critical chapter. There is a narrow window in the geometry of the Earth spacecraft relationship that the navigation teams have been building toward since the moment Artemis II left Earth orbit. It is called the entry corridor, and it is not a metaphor, it is a literal angular slice of space defined by the geometry of Earth's atmosphere and the velocity of the incoming capsule. Too steep, and the capsule comes in too fast, generating heat loads that may exceed thermal protection margins and deceleration forces that exceed crew safety limits. Too shallow, and the capsule skips off the atmosphere into a trajectory that does not support safe landing, or in the extreme case, into an escape trajectory from which return is not possible. The corridor is, in angular terms, quite narrow. The guidance team's job for the past several hours has been to set up a trajectory that threads that needle precisely. Mid-course correction burns, small thruster firings that adjust the trajectory in the days and hours before entry, have been executed according to the mission timeline. Each burn is calculated to bring the entry angle closer to the nominal target, trimming the approach to hit the corridor center with as much margin as possible. The final corrections happen close enough to atmospheric entry that the room for further adjustment becomes very small. At some point in the approach sequence, the trajectory is effectively committed. The geometry is locked. What happens next is between the vehicle and the atmosphere. The operational tone inside mission control during this phase has been described by people who have worked those positions as a particular kind of focused quiet. The celebration cadence of a successful lunar flyby is long gone. The room is running checklists. Systems are being brought into re-entry configuration. The crew is strapping in, going through their own sequences, verifying that every system that needs to be active is active, that every system that should be in re-entry mode is in re-entry mode. There is a procedural rhythm to it, call and response, confirmation and acknowledgement, that is almost meditative in its structure, because the structure is exactly what keeps human beings functional in high-stakes environments. The ritual of the checklist is not bureaucracy. It is the accumulated wisdom of every mission that found out the hard way what happens when something gets skipped. The plasma sheath begins to form at approximately 120 kilometers altitude, as the capsule's velocity starts compressing the upper atmosphere into temperatures that ionize the air molecules around the vehicle. The visual effect, if you were watching from outside, would be extraordinary. A streak of ionized gas, a fireball trailing across the upper atmosphere at hypersonic speed, the thermal energy of re-entry made briefly visible. Inside the capsule, the crew experiences the onset of deceleration, the G-forces beginning to build as the atmosphere starts to slow the vehicle, the glow of plasma becoming visible in the capsule windows, and then the radio silence. Telemetry drops. The mission control screens go flat on the vehicle status data. The voice loop goes quiet, and the room waits. This is the plasma blackout, and it lasts, depending on the specific entry parameters, somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes for the first atmospheric interaction in a skip re-entry profile. 3 to 5 minutes during which the capsule is executing its most demanding flight sequence. The heat shield is experiencing its first thermal peak. The guidance computers are making corrections based on sensor data that has been through a 72-hour charged particle environment, and the AV coat material is either behaving according to the updated models or producing another surprise. All of this is happening. None of it is visible from the ground. None of it can be influenced from the ground. After the first dip, the capsule exits the atmosphere briefly. The skip. Telemetry comes back. A brief window of contact as the vehicle transitions to the intermediate phase. Engineers confirm vehicle status, confirm guidance state, confirm the trajectory for second entry, and then the capsule tips back down. The second entry begins. The second heating peak builds. The plasma sheath forms again. Blackout resumes. And now the guidance system is navigating the second atmospheric interaction from the initial conditions that the first interaction produced, including whatever the heat shield actually did during that first pass, and whatever the sensor suite actually measured, and whatever the accumulated effect of 72 hours in an electron flux environment actually produced in the avionics. This is the moment where every upstream uncertainty collects its bill. The individual acceptable risks, the model divergences, the certified unknowns, they are all present simultaneously, right now, in the most demanding flight environment the vehicle will experience on this mission. Mission control is watching a screen. The audience watching coverage is watching a graphic. And the engineering is either going to hold or it isn't. The parachutes open, telemetry returns, the capsule descends over the Pacific Ocean, and mission control gets its first confirmation that the vehicle survived re-entry. The recovery team begins moving toward the splashdown zone. The crew is alive. The mission is essentially complete. And in the hours and days that follow, engineers will begin pulling apart the data, the thermal imaging of the heat shield, the recorded sensor logs, the navigation trace, the dosimetry readings, looking for the information that only real flight can provide. They will be looking for the answer to a question that, at this moment, nobody can give you with certainty. Did the heat shield behave the way the updated models predicted, or did it diverge again? Did 72 hours of sustained elevated electron flux produce measurable effects in the guidance avionics? Did the skip re-entry execute cleanly against its nominal profile, or did the post-flight trace reveal corrections that exceeded the predicted envelope? These questions are not hypothetical risks invented for dramatic effect. They are the questions that the post-flight engineering review will formally address, because they are the questions that determine whether the models that will be used to certify every future Artemis mission are valid. This is the thing that spaceflight teaches, eventually, to everyone who works in it long enough. We do not prove that a system is safe. Safety is not a provable theorem. What we do is reduce uncertainty, test by test, flight by flight, anomaly by anomaly, until the remaining uncertainty is small enough to accept. We build models and we fly them, and we compare what happened to what we predicted, and we close the gap as much as we can. And then we fly again. The gap between prediction and reality is never fully closed, because reality operates on more variables than any model tracks. The goal is not to eliminate that gap. The goal is to understand it well enough that when it produces a surprise, the surprise falls within margins that the vehicle and the crew can absorb. Artemis II is not just a mission, it is a calibration event. Every anomaly observed, every model that held, and every model that didn't, every system behavior under real deep space conditions that differs even slightly from the pre-flight prediction, all of it becomes the foundation on which the next mission is built. Artemis III, which will put boots on the lunar surface, will fly on the confidence generated by what Artemis II teaches us today. The stakes of this re-entry, in other words, are not just about these 4 crew members, as vital as they are. The stakes are epistemic. They are about what we know and what we think we know, and how honest we are about the difference. The real question was never whether they could reach the moon. That question was answered by the launch and answered again by the flyby. The real question, the one that this entire mission exists to answer, whether or not any press release frames it that way, is whether we understand this system well enough to trust it. Whether the physics behaves the same way twice. Whether the gap between our models and reality is small enough to build a future on. And in a few minutes, or hours, or however long it takes the heat shield to either confirm or complicate everything we thought we knew, we will have a little more information than we had before. We will never have all of it. That is what it means to be a species that has decided to leave the planet. You reduce uncertainty until it is manageable, and then you fly, because the alternative is staying home. And it turns out, looking at a small blue circle in a window 400,000 kilometers away, that home is worth coming back to.